The story begins not with a crown, not with a wedding, but with a question. What happens when the fairy tale you were promised turns out to be nothing more than a carefully staged performance? Picture this: Prince Alexander, beloved by millions, standing on the balcony of a palace, waving with the kind of boyish smile that made the world believe he had finally found happiness. Beside him, Duchess Elena, elegant, radiant, her every glance a promise of loyalty. To the outside world, they were the couple that defied the odds. The rebel prince and the outsider duchess. Two souls rewriting tradition, rewriting destiny. But what if that entire love story was built on cracks that no one wanted to see? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You're about to hear a tale of betrayal, manipulation, and secrets so sharp they could cut through centuries of royal legacy. And I need to warn you, this is not a story for the faint of heart. Because what begins as romance ends as revelation. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to tell who is the victim and who is the villain. But let's stop here. Let me ask you, have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored every warning sign, every whispered doubt, every glance that didn't quite add up? That is where Prince Alexander found himself. And it is where our story begins. The cameras loved them. The press adored them. The world cheered when they walked hand in hand, daring to break rules no one else dared to touch. But what no one realized was that behind closed doors, in quiet corners of gilded halls, another story was unfolding. A story no one wanted to believe. And isn't that the irony? The same media that crowned Elena the perfect duchess would later whisper the rumors that brought the entire house of cards crashing down. But we'll get there. For now, we must travel back to the beginning. To the whirlwind that swept Alexander off his feet, blinded him, and left him unable to see what was right in front of him. Imagine the first time they met. A dinner party in the city, chandeliers glittering overhead, conversations buzzing with the kind of empty glamour only the rich can afford. Elena walked in, not as a duchess, not as a royal consort, but as a woman who knew the power of her presence. And Alexander? He was hooked, almost instantly. Have you ever seen someone fall too fast, too hard, with no safety net? That was him. And from that moment on, he would ignore the red flags that everyone else saw waving. But before you judge him, think about this. Haven't you done the same? Haven't you once believed that love could fix everything, that loyalty was guaranteed, that betrayal was something that happened to other people, never to you? The court advisors warned him. Friends whispered caution. Even family members shifted uncomfortably, trying to hint at what they sensed but couldn't quite prove. And still, Alexander pressed forward, convinced that love would conquer all. But love doesn't conquer lies. It never has, and it never will. Now, here's where the story takes its first twist. Because while Alexander was dreaming of a life free from royal expectations, Elena was dreaming too. But her dream wasn't the same. She wanted the crown, the attention, the stage. She wanted a kingdom at her feet. And she knew exactly how to get it. Does that shock you? Or did you already suspect it? That's the thing about stories like this. Once you start pulling the thread, the whole fabric unravels. Let's pause here. Can you feel it? The tension in your chest? The thought forming in your mind. If Elena's love wasn't real, then what was it? Was it strategy? Was it survival? Or was it something far darker? And here's the part that will keep you awake tonight. Alexander didn't find out until it was far too late. Because as the world celebrated their romance, Elena was weaving another web, one that stretched beyond palace walls, into private rooms, into late-night phone calls, into whispers exchanged when she thought no one was listening. You think you know betrayal? You don't. Not yet. Because betrayal, real betrayal, is not a knife in the back. It's a kiss on the cheek while the knife waits patiently, hidden, until the exact moment it will cut the deepest. And this betrayal? It was orchestrated with a precision that would make even the coldest strategist proud. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we uncover Elena's secrets, we must first understand how she earned the trust of an entire nation. How she convinced millions that she was the savior of a fading monarchy. How she turned skepticism into sympathy, doubt into devotion. Because only then can we fully appreciate the devastation that followed. So I ask you, are you ready to see the curtain pulled back? Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew about fairy tales? About loyalty? About love itself? Because once you step into this story, there's no going back. Think of this as a mirror. A mirror not just into the lives of Alexander and Elena, but into your own. Because their story is not just about royalty. It's about trust, about the lies we choose to believe, about the warnings we silence in our own minds. And when the truth comes crashing in, it leaves no one untouched. The first cracks began with whispers. Whispers the palace ignored, the press dismissed, the public refused to hear. But whispers have a way of growing louder, of becoming roars. And soon, those whispers would erupt into headlines that shook the monarchy to its core. But before we reach that explosion, let's linger in the silence before the storm. The honeymoon phase. The period where everything looked perfect, but nothing was. Because perfection is the greatest disguise of all. And while Alexander was basking in the glow of new love, Elena was calculating her next move. Now let me ask you, what would you do if you discovered the person you trusted most had been playing you all along? Would you walk away? Would you fight back? Or would you cling to the dream, even as it slipped through your fingers? That's the choice Alexander would eventually face. And the tragedy? By the time he realized it, the game had already been lost. This, then, is not just a love story gone wrong. It is a blueprint of manipulation, a study of ambition, a warning to anyone who believes too easily in happy endings. But the happy ending was never real. And as you will soon see, the ending Alexander and Elena faced was darker, messier, and more unforgettable than anyone could have predicted. Stay with me, because the next chapter, it will expose the very first moment when the dream began to crack. And once you see it, you'll never look at them, or yourself, the same way again. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what a single night can do? How one chance meeting, one spark, can alter the course of an entire life? That's where this story truly begins. Not with a wedding, not with a crown, but with a single evening that would set everything into motion. It was supposed to be just another society event. One of those glittering galas where champagne flowed like rivers, laughter echoed beneath chandeliers, and the wealthy mingled as though the rest of the world did not exist. Prince Alexander had attended dozens before. To him, they were predictable, rehearsed, almost painfully dull. But this night would be different. Elena entered the room not as royalty, not even as someone who belonged to the inner circle of nobility, but as an outsider. A woman who, at first glance, seemed out of place. And yet, the second she walked through those doors, the air shifted. Have you ever felt that? The way a single presence can silence a room? That was Elena. Every head turned. Every conversation faltered. Even Alexander, who had grown immune to glamour, felt his heart pause in his chest. And here's the irony. Alexander had come that night prepared to leave early. He was tired of the charades, tired of the polite conversations that meant nothing, tired of playing the part of the charming prince. But when he saw Elena, something changed. Suddenly, he wasn't bored. He was curious. Why her? That's the question everyone asked later. What was it about Elena that drew him in so completely, so instantly? Perhaps it was her confidence, the way she carried herself as though she belonged in every room she entered. Perhaps it was her smile, mysterious enough to feel like a secret only he could unlock. Or perhaps, and this is the darker possibility, it was because she wanted him to notice. Because here's what we must understand about Elena. Nothing she did was without intention. From the tilt of her head to the sparkle in her eyes, she knew how to play her part. And that night, her part was simple. She wasn't just meeting a prince. She was auditioning for a role in history. Alexander approached her with the ease of someone who had been trained his entire life to charm. But what he didn't realize was that, for the first time, he wasn't the one leading the dance. Elena had already decided how the evening would unfold. Their first conversation was like something from a script. Quick, witty exchanges. Jokes that seemed effortless. Glances that lingered just a second too long. And while others saw two people falling into an innocent flirtation, Elena saw opportunity. Let me ask you, have you ever met someone who seemed to know you better than you knew yourself, within minutes? That's how Alexander felt. But what he didn't understand was that Elena had done her homework. She knew his struggles, his longing for freedom, his disdain for palace politics. She pressed all the right buttons. And like a lock snapping open, Alexander's heart surrendered. Now, some will say this is romantic, that it was destiny, that the stars aligned, and two souls found each other. But let me challenge you. What if destiny had nothing to do with it? What if what looked like fate was, in fact, calculation? Because later, much later, Alexander would look back on that night and wonder, was any of it real? The evening blurred into a haze of laughter and dancing. The gala, once dull, now seemed alive. For the first time in years, Alexander felt seen, understood. And yet, in that very moment, Elena was already plotting her next move. She knew how quickly rumors spread in royal circles. She knew that being seen with Alexander would ignite curiosity, and she wanted that. Every glance they exchanged, every shared laugh, was another thread in the story she wanted people to tell. And tell it they did. By the next morning, whispers filled the palace. The prince had been smitten. The outsider had captured his attention. And from that moment on, Elena was no longer just another guest at a party. She was a name on everyone's lips. But behind the sparkle of that night, something far more dangerous was brewing. Because while Alexander saw possibility, Elena saw power. And power, once tasted, is never easily surrendered. Can you see it now? The seeds being planted? The foundation of a story that would eventually unravel in betrayal? Here's the truth. Love, when it begins, feels intoxicating. It blinds us. It convinces us to silence our doubts, to ignore the quiet warnings in the corners of our minds. Alexander, swept up in the thrill of new affection, did exactly that. He convinced himself that he had finally found someone who loved him for who he was, not for what he represented. But was that true? The night ended with promises. Whispered words exchanged as though they were secrets meant only for two. Elena knew exactly what to say to keep Alexander hooked. And as he left that gala, his heart raced not with suspicion, but with hope. But here's the chilling part. Elena left with something else. Not hope, not even love. She left with certainty. Certainty that she had found the perfect role, the perfect stage, the perfect man to elevate her beyond anything she had ever imagined. And that certainty would drive every decision she made from that night forward. Let me ask you again. Can you remember the first time you met someone who changed everything for you? Hold that feeling in your mind. Now imagine that everything you believed about that moment was a lie. That's the reality Alexander would one day face. But not yet. For now, he was lost in the glow of infatuation. And the world, watching from the outside, was ready to fall in love with their love story. The stage was set. The actors had taken their places. The performance had begun. And while Alexander believed he was living a fairy tale, Elena knew she was writing a script of her own. What came next would solidify her role not just in his life, but in the history of the monarchy itself. But if only Alexander had known. The first cracks had already begun to form. And soon, those cracks would shatter everything. Because the night they met wasn't just the beginning of a romance. It was the beginning of the end. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They called it a whirlwind. A love story that seemed unstoppable, unstoppable in its speed, unstoppable in its force. Prince Alexander and Elena were suddenly everywhere, in the tabloids, in glossy magazine spreads, in whispers traded over breakfast tables. But the truth? It wasn't just a whirlwind. It was a storm that would eventually rip through every part of Alexander's life. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's linger for a moment in the honeymoon illusion. Do you remember the early days of falling in love? The way time bends, the way the smallest gesture feels monumental? For Alexander, those early days with Elena were intoxicating. Every message she sent, every smile she offered, every promise she whispered felt like proof that he had finally escaped the cold, rigid world of duty that had trapped him since childhood. And here's the irony. The more he believed he was escaping, the deeper into the trap he fell. From the outside, it was picture perfect. Stolen weekends in secluded countryside homes. Romantic dinners lit only by candlelight. Walks where their laughter seemed to echo louder than the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. The world saw love. Alexander saw freedom. But Elena? Elena saw opportunity. Because every move she made was deliberate. She didn't just love-bomb him. She constructed an entire world where he felt safe, seen, understood. She knew his insecurities. His resentment of palace traditions. His longing to be seen as more than a prince. And she fed those insecurities carefully, like embers being stoked into flames. Alexander, you don't need them, she would say. They'll never understand you the way I do. And he believed her. How could he not? She was saying the very things he had always wanted to hear. But let me ask you, have you ever been told exactly what you wanted to hear, only to later discover it was manipulation? How many times did Alexander replay those words in his mind, not realizing they were chains disguised as freedom? The public lapped it up. The press branded them as modern, rebellious, untouchable. The fairy tale was irresistible. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Tiny ones, almost invisible. The kind of cracks that you dismiss at first, until one day, the entire structure collapses. Take, for instance, the way Elena controlled access. Slowly, subtly, she began to position herself as Alexander's gatekeeper. Friends who had once spoken to him freely now had to go through her. Advisors who once guided him found themselves shut out. Family members who tried to warn him noticed the distance growing, inch by inch, word by word. But Alexander brushed it all aside. He was in love. And isn't that the oldest excuse in the world? Here's a detail most people forget. Early on, Elena began keeping a diary. Not the kind filled with heartfelt confessions, but the kind that read like a strategist's notebook. Plans, contacts, opportunities. She was always looking 3 steps ahead. Alexander never saw it, but those close to her knew. They knew this wasn't just romance. It was ambition, plain and sharp. And yet, Alexander convinced himself that he had found the one person who understood him. He ignored the raised eyebrows, the whispered warnings, the subtle shifts in his inner circle. But here's where the illusion turns dangerous. Once someone convinces you that the world is against you, you cling to them even tighter. And that's exactly what Elena wanted. The honeymoon phase wasn't just about love. It was about isolation. The more Alexander withdrew from others, the more he depended on her. And dependence, when it comes to power, is the ultimate weapon. Now, I want you to pause and think. Who holds more power? The one wearing the crown, or the one who whispers into the crown wearer's ear? By now, you can see it, can't you? The subtle pattern. The smile that seemed too perfect. The words that felt rehearsed. The way Elena moved like someone who wasn't just living in the moment, but directing it. And yet, Alexander was blind. Or maybe he chose to be blind. After all, isn't it easier to believe in a dream than to face the nightmare lurking underneath? The press called it destiny. The palace called it dangerous. But Alexander? He called it love. Do you see the tragedy forming? The audience, us, can see what he could not. That's the cruel trick of hindsight. But let's step closer to the cracks. Because they're about to grow louder, clearer, harder to ignore. One of the first warning signs came in the form of an old friend. Someone who had known Alexander long before Elena. Over dinner one night, this friend leaned in and whispered, "Be careful. She wants something. I don't know what, but it's not you." Alexander laughed it off. He told Elena about it later, expecting her to laugh with him. Instead, she turned the moment into proof of betrayal. "See," she said, "they don't want you happy. They're jealous. They'll do anything to tear us apart." And just like that, the wedge deepened. Alexander sided with Elena. The friend drifted away. Another voice silenced. "Can you feel it? The trap closing?" The honeymoon illusion wasn't just about romance. It was about control. And while the world saw hand-holding and soft smiles, Alexander was being drawn further and further into Elena's orbit. But the thing about illusions is that they never last forever. Eventually, the cracks break open. Eventually, the truth spills out. And soon, Alexander would be forced to face a question he never thought he'd have to ask. Was Elena's love ever real? But before that moment came, Elena would tighten her grip even further. The world would fall deeper in love with their story. The palace would grow more uneasy. And Alexander would continue to ignore the signs. Because when you're in the middle of the storm, it's impossible to see the destruction forming on the horizon. The fairy tale wasn't just beginning. It was already unraveling. And the first major scandal? The one that would tear the curtain back and reveal the truth? It was closer than anyone realized. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It didn't happen with a headline. It didn't happen with a scandal splashed across front pages. No, the beginning of the unraveling came with something far smaller, far quieter. Whispers. And if you've ever lived in a world of wealth, influence, or power, you'll know, whispers are more dangerous than shouts. At first, the whispers seemed harmless. A raised eyebrow here, a curious glance there. Court attendants exchanged knowing looks when Elena entered a room. Household staff spoke in hushed tones, careful not to be overheard. The whispers weren't about love, they were about motive. "She's ambitious," one lady-in-waiting murmured behind her fan. "She's clever," another replied. But the unspoken question hung heavy. Clever enough to outmaneuver a prince? And here's the thing about whispers: they grow. Like seeds planted in fertile soil, they sprout, take root, and spread until an entire garden is overrun. Alexander, of course, brushed them aside. He told himself they were jealous. He told himself Elena was a victim of snobbery, prejudice, small-mindedness. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. Outsiders have always faced resistance when stepping into circles built on centuries of tradition. But what he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that buried in those whispers was a truth he desperately needed to hear. Let me ask you, have you ever ignored a warning because it didn't fit the story you wanted to believe? That's what Alexander did. And in doing so, he sealed his own fate. The first real sign came not from the palace, but from Elena's own world. A man, a name we'll call Marcus, appeared in conversations where he didn't belong. Marcus was charming, well-connected, the kind of man who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. And he had a history with Elena. The whispers began: late-night phone calls, secret meetings, messages exchanged in the kind of coded language only lovers understand. At first, no one dared confront Alexander with these rumors. After all, how could they? He was glowing, radiant with the energy of new love. To question Elena was to question his judgment. But palace staff noticed. They always notice. One aide, tasked with delivering a letter, found Elena in a quiet corner of the palace gardens, speaking into her phone in hushed tones. She didn't notice the aide. She didn't notice the way her laughter carried. But the aide noticed. And that night, the whisper grew louder. Elena's hiding something. And just like that, the seed of doubt was planted. But let's pause here. Do you believe in coincidence? Do you believe that every strange glance, every suspicious word, can be explained away as harmless? Or do you believe, as I do, that where there is smoke, there is fire? For Alexander, it was all smoke. Nothing tangible. Nothing he could hold in his hand as proof. And so he ignored it. But for those watching from the shadows, the fire was already raging. Here's the cruel twist. Elena was good. Too good. She anticipated suspicion before it grew dangerous. She wove narratives so convincing that even the boldest accusations crumbled. If Alexander's friend suggested she seemed distracted, Elena would weep softly, saying, "They don't want me here. They'll never accept me. I only want you." And Alexander, desperate to protect her, would lash out at anyone who dared question her loyalty. Can you see it? The web tightening? The walls closing in? But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder. They spread beyond palace walls, into social circles, into the very newspapers that had once celebrated her. At first, the papers wrote cautiously, with phrases like "sources suggest" and "insiders claim." Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough to plant questions in the public's mind. And questions, once planted, are nearly impossible to uproot. Imagine being Alexander. Everywhere he turned, he was forced to defend her. To friends, to family, to the press. The more he defended her, the more suspicious he appeared. After all, why defend so fiercely if there was nothing to hide? This is the irony of scandal. Denial often becomes confirmation. The first official confrontation came at a family gathering. Over dinner, one of Alexander's relatives, an uncle known for his bluntness, leaned across the table and said, "You need to watch her. She's not what she seems." The room fell silent. Alexander's face burned. Elena, ever the actress, lowered her gaze and whispered, "This is what I feared. They'll never let us be happy." And in that moment, Alexander made a choice. He chose her, not because he was certain she was innocent, but because he couldn't bear the alternative. To admit the whispers might be true was to admit that his entire world, his love, his trust, his future, was built on sand. But denial doesn't stop the tide. It only delays the flood. Behind the palace walls, Elena continued her quiet conversations with Marcus. Whether they were innocent or not, we may never know. What mattered was perception, and perception was damning. The whispers turned into rumors. The rumors turned into stories. And soon, the stories would become headlines. But before that moment came, Alexander clung tighter. He isolated further. He convinced himself that the world was out to destroy their happiness. And in doing so, he walked willingly into the very trap Elena had set. Because here's the question you must ask yourself. Was Elena careless, or was she calculated? Did she allow the whispers to spread, knowing they would drive Alexander deeper into her arms? Or did she simply underestimate how far those whispers would reach? Either way, the result was the same. Doubt had entered the story. And doubt, once present, never leaves. It grows, festers, infects every thought, every glance, every word. And as the palace struggled to contain the whispers, Elena made her boldest move yet. She turned the narrative to her advantage. In an interview carefully staged for maximum sympathy, she tearfully described how difficult it was to be misunderstood, how cruel the press could be, how painful it was to be accused of things she hadn't done. The public swooned. Headlines praised her vulnerability. Alexander saw her as a victim, but others? Others saw a performance. And soon, even Alexander would be forced to ask himself, was it all an act? The whispers had become a roar, and the first scandal was about to break wide open. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every great story has a breaking point. The moment when the shine wears off, when the mask slips, when the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, begins to bleed through. For Prince Alexander and Duchess Elena, that moment came not in private, not within palace walls, but under the unrelenting gaze of the public. It began with a photograph. Just one image. Grainy, poorly lit, snapped by a stranger who didn't realize the explosion it would ignite. The picture showed Elena in the corner of a cafe, not with Alexander, but with Marcus. Their heads bent close together, their laughter frozen mid-frame. To most, it might have seemed innocent, even meaningless. But context is everything, and in the context of whispers already swirling, this single image was dynamite. By morning, the photograph was everywhere, splashed across tabloids, circulating on gossip forums, shared and reshared with captions like, "What was really going on? And who was the man stealing the Duchess's attention?" And here's the cruel part. No one cared if the photo proved anything. The power wasn't in the truth. It was in the suggestion. Do you see it? That's the trick of scandal. It doesn't need facts. It only needs a spark. And this spark set the entire kingdom ablaze. Alexander woke to chaos. Advisors called it a security breach. Courtiers called it an embarrassment. His family called it a warning. But Alexander? He called it nothing. He refused to see it for what it was. She was meeting a friend, he said, his voice sharp with irritation. Can't a woman have friends? But inside, doubt crept in. Quiet, relentless, poisonous. Because when he asked Elena about the photo, her explanation was too smooth, too rehearsed. Marcus is just someone I've known for years, she said, her eyes shimmering with manufactured sincerity. We were catching up, that's all. Honestly, Alexander, the way people twist things, it's exhausting. It makes me feel like I can't even breathe. And just like that, she turned the spotlight away from herself and onto him. Onto his need to protect her. Onto his guilt for doubting her, even for a second. Let me ask you, have you ever suspected someone you love, only to be made to feel like the villain for even entertaining the thought? That's where Alexander found himself. Trapped not by the photo, but by his own emotions. The press, meanwhile, feasted on the story. Talk shows debated endlessly. Was Elena unfaithful? Was Marcus more than a friend? Why had Alexander not been with her? Every angle was dissected, exaggerated, amplified until it became something larger than life. And Elena, master of performance, played her role flawlessly. She appeared at charity events looking serene, untouchable, gracious in the face of so-called cruelty. The public divided. Some defended her fiercely, painting her as a victim of misogyny and media intrusion. Others questioned her every move, scrutinizing her body language, her choice of words, the way her hand lingered on Alexander's arm. Was it love, or was it strategy? But the real fracture wasn't in the public. It was in Alexander himself. For the first time, he couldn't silence the questions in his own mind. The photo replayed in his thoughts at night. The laughter between Elena and Marcus echoed like a ghost. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But something inside him whispered otherwise. And yet, every time he considered pressing harder, Elena would disarm him with tears, with confessions of loneliness, with declarations that he was the only man she had ever truly loved. How do you fight that? How do you fight words that cut directly into your deepest insecurities? The palace, however, wasn't so easily swayed. Behind closed doors, meetings were held. Strategies discussed. Officials debated whether Elena was a liability, whether the monarchy itself was being dragged into a scandal it might not survive. But here's the bitter truth. The more they pushed against her, the stronger she became. She used their resistance as proof that she was being victimized, that she was an outsider under attack. And Alexander, blinded by love and loyalty, defended her with a ferocity that stunned even his harshest critics. The result? A kingdom divided. On one side, a prince who refused to believe the worst. On the other, a duchess who seemed to thrive on the chaos. And in between, a public addicted to the drama, unable to look away, desperate for the next headline. This was no longer a fairy tale. This was theater. And yet, beneath the spectacle, something darker stirred. Because while Elena convinced the world of her innocence, Marcus remained. Always nearby, always in the shadows. Alexander noticed. He saw the way Elena's phone lit up late at night. He saw the way her mood shifted when messages came in. He asked questions, of course he did. But the answers, always polished, always convincing, left him more confused than before. Was he paranoid? Or was he finally beginning to see the truth? Here's the tragedy. He didn't know. He couldn't know. And that uncertainty ate at him more than any accusation ever could. Because betrayal isn't just about the act itself. It's about the not knowing, the questioning, the endless replaying of moments, searching for clues you missed. And as Alexander spiraled inward, Elena rose higher. Her public image became untouchable. Her supporters rallied louder than ever. And Marcus? Marcus slipped quietly into the background, never denying, never confirming, letting the whispers grow louder on their own. The photograph had cracked the fairy tale, but what followed would shatter it completely. Because soon, evidence would surface that could no longer be dismissed. Evidence Alexander could not ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. And when that moment came, the choice he faced would not just be about Elena. It would be about himself, his family, his legacy. But that's the cruelest part of this story. By the time he realized the truth, it may already have been too late. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It always starts with whispers. Then comes suspicion. Then, inevitably, comes evidence. The kind that cannot be laughed off. The kind that cannot be explained away with clever words or teary-eyed performances. For Prince Alexander, this moment arrived like a hammer blow, sharp and undeniable. But it didn't come in the form of a headline. It came quietly, almost too quietly. One late evening, Alexander was pacing the palace study, restless. Sleep wouldn't come. The photograph of Elena and Marcus still haunted him, looping endlessly in his thoughts. He wanted to believe her story. He wanted to believe in their love. But the unease inside him had grown louder, more insistent. That's when an aide slipped into the room. A man who had served the family for years. His face was pale, his voice hesitant. "Your Highness," he said, holding out a small envelope. "You should see this." Inside were photographs. Not grainy, not distant, not questionable. Clear, crisp. Elena and Marcus, walking side by side down a quiet street. Elena's hand brushing his arm. Their heads bent close together, laughing. Another photo. Marcus's car parked discreetly near a hotel. Elena, disguised in a scarf and sunglasses, slipping through the entrance. The timestamps told the story. Alexander's heart pounded. His breath came shallow. This couldn't be real. Could it? He stared at the photographs for what felt like hours. His mind raced with questions. Was it innocent? Could it be explained? Or was this the proof everyone had been whispering about? And here's the cruelty of evidence. It doesn't tell you the whole truth. It only shows fragments. Enough to suggest. Enough to haunt. Enough to destroy. When he confronted Elena, her reaction was immediate and devastating. She didn't deny. She didn't rage. She wept. "Why don't you trust me?" she cried, her voice trembling, her hands clutching at his arms. "Do you know how humiliating it is to have people following me? To have my every move dissected? Marcus was helping me, Alexander. Helping me escape the suffocation. That's all." And just like that, the focus shifted. Alexander wasn't the betrayed lover. He was the villain. The one who dared question her loyalty. Have you ever been there? Accusing someone only to walk away feeling like you're the guilty one? That's where Alexander stood. But the photographs remained. Cold, silent, unforgiving. And they weren't the only evidence. Soon, messages surfaced. Texts leaked from somewhere deep inside the palace staff. Casual words. Flirtatious phrases. Too intimate to be dismissed as friendship. Last night was perfect. Can't wait until we're alone again. Does he suspect? The messages were damning. Yet Elena had explanations for every line. It's not what it looks like, she insisted. They've twisted the context. People will do anything to destroy us. And Alexander, torn between his heart and his reason, clung to her words. Because what was the alternative? To admit that the love of his life had betrayed him? To admit that his fairy tale was a lie? But denial is a fragile shield. And cracks were forming fast. The palace was no longer able to contain the storm. Leaks became headlines. Headlines became scandals. The Duchess and her mystery man. Is the royal marriage a sham? Betrayal in the palace? Each morning brought fresh humiliation. Each evening brought another confrontation. And through it all, Elena's brilliance never faltered. In public, she remained poised, graceful, untouchable. In private, she wielded guilt like a weapon, keeping Alexander off balance, keeping him desperate to prove himself to her. But even as he defended her, doubt gnawed at him. The photographs, the texts, the late-night phone calls, the way her eyes sometimes darted away when he asked simple questions. And then came the moment he could no longer escape. One night, returning early from a trip he had told no one about, Alexander walked the quiet halls of their private residence. A light glowed beneath the library door. He pushed it open and froze. Elena was there, not alone. Marcus sat across from her, his voice low, his smile easy. On the table between them lay 2 glasses of wine, half empty. Elena turned, startled, her face pale. "Alexander," she stammered. "I can explain." But explain what? The intimacy of the scene? The comfort in Marcus's posture? The guilt flashing across Elena's eyes before she masked it with tears? Alexander stood in silence, his world crashing around him. Every photograph, every whisper, every rumor coalesced into one undeniable reality. This was not paranoia. This was not fabrication. This was betrayal. And yet, even then, Elena fought. She pleaded. She twisted. She turned the moment into another act of cruelty against her. "Do you see what they've done?" she cried. "They've driven you to spy on me. They've poisoned you against me. You're destroying us, Alexander. Not me. You." And there it was again, the inversion, the manipulation, the cruelest trick of all. Can you imagine his torment? To stand in the doorway of his own home, seeing with his own eyes the very thing he had been warned about, and still doubt himself? Still wonder if he was the problem? Because betrayal doesn't just break trust. It breaks reality. It makes you question your own mind, your own instincts, your own sanity. But the truth could no longer be buried. Not with photographs. Not with messages. Not with late-night encounters caught by watchful eyes. The evidence had emerged. And though Alexander tried desperately to cling to the illusion was shattering. And here is the most devastating part. The world was watching. The fairy tale had cracked, and now the audience wanted blood. Every magazine, every news outlet, every gossip site was circling. The story was no longer whispers. It was war. And in war, there are casualties. The question was, who would fall first? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the evidence surfaced, nothing would ever be the same. Not the palace, not the media, not Alexander, and certainly not Elena. For Alexander, the world had turned upside down. He had spent years believing in a love story that seemed unshakable, a bond stronger than scandal, stronger than gossip, stronger than the court itself. But now, the very foundation of his life had cracked. Every decision he had made, every vow he had taken, felt like it had been built on sand. The palace, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, advisors exchanged frantic glances, and servants walked on eggshells, fearing they would become part of the story themselves. Alexander was no longer a prince at ease in his own home. He was a man caught in a web of suspicion, guilt, and fear. Meanwhile, Elena thrived publicly. At first glance, she seemed untouchable. Every appearance was a carefully orchestrated masterpiece. Cameras caught her smiling, engaging with the public, her poise perfect, her elegance untarnished. The world, starved for drama, couldn't get enough. Social media exploded with debates, tweets, and heated commentary. Every day, new narratives appeared, some claiming Elena was a victim of media persecution, some questioning Alexander's judgment, others speculating about the depth of her betrayal. But behind the public facade, the private reality was something darker. The palace walls, once echoing with laughter and life, now seemed to trap every whispered suspicion. Alexander could feel eyes on him wherever he went, colleagues watching for signs of weakness, journalists lurking in shadows. Trust became a rare commodity. Every gesture, every glance from Elena was measured, loaded with meaning. At first, Alexander tried to reason with her. He attempted calm conversations, measured questions. But Elena had become a master of diversion. Each time he raised a point, she would pivot, redirect, or confront him with guilt. "Why can't you believe in us?" she asked one night, her voice soft yet accusing. "Do you want them to be right about me? Do you want to destroy the very thing we've built together?" And Alexander, exhausted, torn between love and reality, would falter. Because the love he had once felt so intensely had not disappeared. It had become something dangerous, a lever she could pull to bend him to her will. But it wasn't just the emotional strain. The evidence had given others leverage, too. Politicians, advisors, even family members saw opportunity in the chaos. Power plays emerged, alliances shifted, and Alexander realized he was not only fighting Elena's deception, he was navigating a minefield of betrayal on all sides. The media, merciless as ever, reported every rumor as fact. Headlines screamed accusations. Paparazzi lurked around every corner. One morning, Alexander opened a newspaper to find a photo of Elena and Marcus at a quiet resort. Captions speculating on the nature of their relationship, even implying that Marcus might have been a part of a long-running secret life she had kept hidden from him. Alexander felt the walls close in. His sense of security, his pride, his identity as a prince and a husband, all being dismantled before his eyes. He asked himself repeatedly, "How did I not see it? Was it my fault? Could I have prevented this?" And while he struggled internally, Elena's grip on public perception grew stronger. Her defenders argued fiercely online, painting Alexander as paranoid, jealous, and controlling. Supporters claimed he had become blinded by suspicion, unable to see the reality of Elena's brilliance and grace. The dichotomy tore him apart. Alexander was vilified for confronting the truth and chastised for questioning it. Every move he made was dissected. Every conversation, private or public, was analyzed for weakness. It was as if the entire world had become a stage, and he was trapped in the role of a villain he never wanted to play. Meanwhile, Marcus, elusive and untouchable, remained in the shadows. His presence loomed over every interaction. He never made a mistake, never gave an interview, never spoke publicly. But the weight of his influence was undeniable. Elena's demeanor, her confidence, even her strategic responses suggested someone guiding her, supporting her behind the scenes. Alexander couldn't escape the sense that Marcus's influence was everywhere, a constant reminder of the betrayal he could not undo. At night, the palace halls felt colder. Alexander wandered alone, revisiting every memory, every conversation, every choice. He analyzed their early days together, searching for signs, replaying moments that had seemed inconsequential but now looked suspicious. Every laugh, every touch, every shared glance became a potential clue, a potential betrayal. But while he unraveled, Elena remained composed. She had a clarity, a focus, a control that Alexander could no longer match. She was playing the long game, weaving a narrative that kept the public on her side, kept Alexander entangled in doubt, kept Marcus safely in the shadows. And then came the turning point, the first undeniable public confrontation. A charity gala meant to showcase royal unity became a stage for subtle warfare. Cameras captured every glance, every shift of posture, every moment of tension between Alexander and Elena. Reporters noted the strained smiles, the awkward distance, and the tense interactions. Every detail was cataloged, analyzed, and broadcasted. The world watched as the fairy tale cracked, frame by frame, in slow, agonizing detail. Alexander tried to hold his composure. He smiled politely. He nodded. He fulfilled his duties. But inwardly, he was collapsing. The man who had once been confident, secure, and untouchable was now consumed by doubt, fear, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. Even his closest advisors warned him to step back, to regain control, to strategize. But Alexander knew, deep down, that the damage was already done. The evidence had ignited a fire that could not be contained. Every step he took seemed to feed the flames. And Elena? She moved like a chess master, positioning herself to control the board entirely. Each smile, each public interaction, each carefully measured word reinforced her narrative of innocence, while Alexander's every hesitation reinforced her story of him as the insecure, paranoid partner. By the end of the night, it was clear nothing would be the same. The palace had fallen into chaos. Alexander's faith in love, loyalty, and even reality had been tested beyond its limits. Elena's power had grown, and Marcus's shadow loomed larger than ever. And yet, just when Alexander believed he had seen the worst, a new revelation surfaced, one so shocking, so unexpected, that it threatened to rewrite everything he thought he knew. Because in the world of betrayal, the most dangerous moments are not when you see the evidence. They are when you realize that the evidence is only part of a much larger, more sinister truth. And that truth, waiting just beyond the next twist, was about to explode. It started with a tweet, then another, then the floodgates opened. No palace walls could contain it. No royal protocol could suppress it. No denial could stop it. The story of Elena, Marcus, and Alexander exploded across social media, traditional news outlets, and gossip blogs. Every corner of the internet buzzed with speculation, outrage, and morbid fascination. Royal betrayal exposed. Is the prince being played? Duchess Elena's secret life. What the palace doesn't want you to know. Love, lies, and a mysterious man. The scandal shocking the world. The headlines screamed. The photos circulated endlessly. Video clips of Elena smiling at Marcus at a private function, Alexander looking tense and withdrawn at the same event, were replayed, analyzed, and dissected. Every glance, every micro-expression was scrutinized. Alexander felt his life unraveling in real time. Every notification pinged like a hammer. Every comment seemed to pierce deeper. Every article made him question what was real and what had been manufactured. He tried to focus on his duties, on public appearances, on family obligations, but it was impossible. The storm was everywhere. And it wasn't just the media. It was the public. Fans of the royal family were divided, some defending Elena, some siding with Alexander, many more reveling in the drama. Online debates became battles, comment sections turned into war zones, and conspiracy theories flourished like wildfire. Alexander's friends and advisors tried to shield him, tried to control the narrative, but even they admitted it was out of their hands. The palace had become a cage. The public eye, a relentless predator. Elena, of course, thrived. Her team of publicists, strategists, and confidants crafted perfect statements, orchestrated public appearances, and ensured that she always looked composed, confident, and untouchable. Every denial, every smile, every perfectly timed comment added fuel to the story, keeping Alexander on the defensive. The public perception was shifting, and Alexander could feel it. People began to question him. Was he overreacting? Was he controlling? Was he jealous without reason? The very evidence he had uncovered, which had tormented him privately, became a double-edged sword in public discourse. Then came the moment that would haunt him forever, the interview. It was meant to be a private press conference, a chance to clarify the rumors, to assert control. But it quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Reporters asked pointed questions. Cameras zoomed in on every twitch of his face, every hesitation in his voice. Prince Alexander, how do you respond to allegations about your wife's relationship with Marcus? Alexander's throat tightened. His pulse raced. He had rehearsed answers, prepared statements, but the words felt hollow, insufficient. He looked at Elena sitting beside him, composed, serene, and the contrast was unbearable. I cannot comment on unverified claims, he said finally, his voice trembling. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Microphones captured every syllable. Social media exploded with video clips of his statement, each edited to emphasize his hesitation, his uncertainty, his apparent weakness. Meanwhile, Elena leaned forward, her calm gaze unwavering, her response measured and precise. "Prince Alexander's concern is understandable," she said softly. "But these rumors have been blown out of proportion. Our focus remains on our duties and our family." The crowd reacted with applause, a subtle but unmistakable victory. Alexander felt it like a punch to the gut. The media, the public, even the people in that room, they were seeing him falter, while Elena appeared untouchable. But the humiliation didn't end there. Overnight, leaked photos, private texts, and anonymous tips began circulating, further fueling the fire. Every aspect of his life was scrutinized. Every private conversation, every past decision, every gesture toward Elena became evidence in the court of public opinion. Alexander was trapped. No retreat was possible. Every attempt to clarify or defend himself only added to the chaos. He began to question everything: his judgment, his instincts, even his sanity. How had he been so blind? How had he allowed himself to be manipulated? How could the person he loved most inflict so much pain and still appear flawless? And then, the most devastating blow came not from the media, not from Elena, but from his own family. Whispers of doubt, carefully measured, began to circulate. Advisors questioned his judgment. Relatives suggested he had allowed jealousy to cloud his decisions. Some even implied that he had contributed to the narrative of betrayal by overreacting, by attempting to control what could not be controlled. It was a perfect storm of public scrutiny, private betrayal, and familial pressure. Alexander's world had become a battlefield where every ally seemed like a potential enemy, and every action risked further exposure. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus remained a ghost, untouchable, invisible, yet omnipresent in every interaction. Alexander knew that Marcus's influence over Elena was immense, and that the man was pulling strings from the shadows, ensuring that Alexander remained on the defensive. Night after night, Alexander lay awake, haunted by images of Elena and Marcus, by memories of whispered conversations, by the knowledge that the public and private worlds had collided in the most merciless way imaginable. He began to see patterns in the leaks, in the rumors, in the timing of events. It became clear that someone within their circle, someone close, someone trusted, was orchestrating parts of the scandal, feeding information to the press, and ensuring that Alexander bore the brunt of public judgment. And just when he thought he had identified a possible source, another revelation shattered his fragile sense of stability. A message arrived, anonymous, undeniable, and damning. The kind of message that changes everything you thought you knew about trust, loyalty, and love. It wasn't just proof of betrayal anymore. It was proof of something far more sinister. A hidden network, a secret plan, and a truth so shocking that it would redefine the entire story of Elena, Marcus, and Alexander forever. And that truth was waiting, just beyond reach, ready to explode. Because in the world of scandal, the moment you think you've seen the worst, the universe has a way of proving you wrong. And Alexander was about to discover just how wrong he had been. Alexander couldn't believe what he was seeing. At first, it had been subtle, hints, whispers, little anomalies that didn't quite add up. A sudden leak, a strategically timed photo, an inexplicable public comment. All seemingly unrelated, but collectively forming a pattern. And now, with the anonymous message in his hand, the pieces fell together in a way he had never imagined. There was a network, he realized. Not just Marcus, not just Elena. A web of influence, manipulation, and control that stretched far beyond the palace walls, far beyond anyone he had ever suspected. This was a carefully orchestrated operation, designed to protect Elena, manipulate public perception, and isolate him completely. The message contained a series of encrypted communications, private contacts, and meeting locations. It was a blueprint of manipulation, showing how Elena and Marcus had embedded themselves in positions of power, ensuring that every leak, every rumor, and every public misstep worked in their favor. Alexander felt a chill. He had been a pawn all along, unaware of the rules of the game that had been set against him. He began to retrace events, connecting dots that had seemed random. The sudden retraction of certain media stories, the timing of Elena's public appearances, the quiet but deliberate support she had received from unexpected allies. It all made sense now. And the scale of the operation was staggering. Alexander realized that Marcus had not only been guiding Elena personally, but had cultivated a network of insiders, journalists, and political operatives, each playing a role in shaping public perception. Alexander's mind raced. Who could he trust? Everyone around him seemed compromised. Friends, advisors, even members of the royal household could be part of the network. He remembered the whispered conversations, the casual suggestions that seemed innocent at the time, now revealing themselves as carefully placed nudges to destabilize him. The palace, once a symbol of order and tradition, had become a battlefield of secrets. Every room, every corridor, every interaction could conceal a spy or an informant. Alexander felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. He had never felt more alone, more vulnerable, more exposed. But he knew one thing: knowledge was power. And if he could understand the network, if he could map it, if he could anticipate its moves, he might have a chance to reclaim control. He began to compile the information from the message. Names, times, locations, relationships. The network was vast, sophisticated, and frighteningly effective. It was designed to protect Elena at all costs, ensuring that any threat to her reputation or public image would be neutralized before it could gain traction. Alexander realized that Marcus was the mastermind. While Elena had been the face of the operation, Marcus had been the strategist, the unseen hand directing every move. He had orchestrated leaks, timed media appearances, and ensured that Alexander remained reactive, always one step behind. The realization stung. Not only had he been betrayed by the woman he loved, but he had been outmaneuvered at every turn by her accomplice. Despite the shock, Alexander refused to succumb to despair. He had always been resilient, a man accustomed to responsibility and scrutiny. And now, faced with the full scope of the deception, he resolved to fight back. But he would have to be smart, careful, and patient. One wrong move could expose him completely, giving Marcus and Elena even greater leverage. Alexander began to strategize. He would gather evidence, document every interaction, and identify vulnerabilities within the network. He had to move silently, like a chess player anticipating the opponent's moves. Every word, every gesture, every public appearance would be deliberate, calculated, and designed to reclaim control without revealing his hand. Meanwhile, Elena remained blissfully unaware of his awareness. She continued her public engagements, her charitable work, and her carefully curated appearances. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Alexander's quiet vigilance, his subtle inquiries, and his careful documentation were beginning to unsettle her. She sensed a shift, a tension she could not control, a variable in her meticulously orchestrated plan that threatened to unravel everything. As Alexander delved deeper into the network, he uncovered alliances he had never suspected. Political figures, media insiders, even some members of the royal family had been quietly influenced or manipulated to support Elena's narrative. The depth of the betrayal was staggering, and the implications were terrifying. Alexander realized that confronting Elena directly would be dangerous. She was protected by layers of influence, and any attempt to expose her without irrefutable proof could backfire catastrophically. And yet, he could not stand idly by. He needed answers, he needed clarity, and most importantly, he needed a strategy that would allow him to regain control without falling into the traps Marcus had set. The investigation was delicate, painstaking, and fraught with danger. Every lead had to be verified, every source vetted, and every action carefully considered. Alexander knew that one misstep could cost him everything: his reputation, his position, and perhaps even his freedom. But just as he was beginning to map the network, a new revelation arrived, one that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. A secret meeting, scheduled in complete secrecy, was revealed in the encrypted message. The location was unknown, the participants undisclosed, but the implication was clear. Marcus had plans that extended far beyond what Alexander had imagined. The network was not just about protecting Elena or controlling public perception. It was part of a larger, more dangerous strategy, one that could change the balance of power within the palace and beyond. Alexander realized that time was running out. The longer he waited, the more entrenched the network would become, and the harder it would be to dismantle. Every day, Marcus and Elena solidified their control, making their position almost untouchable. And yet, Alexander felt a surge of determination. He had been blindsided before, but he was no longer naive. He understood the stakes, he understood the players, and he understood the rules of the game. Now, he had to act, carefully, strategically, and decisively. The first step would be to infiltrate the network, to identify weaknesses, and to gather evidence that could not be ignored. Alexander knew it would be dangerous, that the slightest mistake could be fatal, and that the consequences of failure were unimaginable. But he also knew that inaction was not an option. As he prepared for the next phase, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow, every unexpected sound, every unexplained event seemed charged with meaning. The network was vast, powerful, and relentless. And Alexander knew that Marcus would not hesitate to strike if he sensed a threat. Yet, in the midst of fear and uncertainty, Alexander felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, he saw the situation not as a victim of betrayal, but as a player in a high-stakes game. He understood that survival, reputation, and love were all on the line, and that every move he made from this point forward would determine the course of his life. And just as he was preparing to take the first step into the unknown, a single message appeared on his secure line, a cryptic note, unsigned, warning him of a betrayal far closer than he had imagined. The walls of the palace no longer felt safe. The people he trusted no longer felt reliable. And the network, with Marcus at its center, loomed larger and more dangerous than ever. Alexander realized that the game had changed, and the next move would determine everything. But the identity of the ultimate threat and the extent of the deception was still shrouded in darkness. What came next would test him like never before, and no one, not even Alexander, could predict the outcome. Alexander had spent countless nights studying the network, mapping its intricate web and identifying the weakest links. Every leak, every manipulated story, every public whisper now had context. Every suspicious smile, every carefully timed appearance. He saw them for what they were. Chess moves in a game he had been blind to until now. It was time to act. But action required precision. One wrong step, one miscalculated move, and everything he had worked for, his reputation, his position, his sense of control, could be destroyed. He had learned that the hard way. Marcus was brilliant at manipulation. Elena was untouchable in her public image. They had allies, sources, and pawns ready to protect them. Alexander needed to strike where they least expected it, silently, invisibly, strategically. He began with reconnaissance. Not flashy, not dramatic, just careful observation. He studied Elena's movements, her schedules, her communications, even her subtle interactions with staff and aides. Every interaction was a potential leak, a potential opportunity, or a potential trap. He made mental notes, cross-referenced them with what he knew about Marcus, and mapped the network's vulnerabilities. The first weak link became apparent in the form of a palace aide named Julian. Julian was ambitious, easily swayed by influence, and prone to gossip. He often facilitated communications for Elena under Marcus's direction. Alexander recognized the opportunity immediately. If he could discreetly gain Julian's trust, he might obtain information that Marcus assumed would never be revealed. Alexander began to plant small signals, subtle tests to gauge Julian's loyalties. A question here, a casual comment there, all carefully designed to elicit reactions without exposing Alexander's intentions. Julian responded exactly as expected, a mixture of curiosity, flattery, and caution. It was the perfect opening. Over weeks, Alexander cultivated a discreet rapport with Julian. He didn't pressure him, didn't threaten him, didn't overtly manipulate. He simply listened, observed, and guided conversations in ways that made Julian feel in control while secretly providing Alexander with valuable insights. Every revelation, every slip of the tongue, every unguarded comment became another piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to monitor Elena. He noticed subtle shifts in her behavior, small, almost imperceptible signs of stress, moments where her usual composure wavered. These cracks were rare, but they existed. Marcus could be everywhere, orchestrating every public appearance, but he could not control every human reaction. Alexander understood that leverage would come from patience and timing, not brute force. Then came the moment that would test Alexander's resolve and skill. A private event, meticulously planned by Elena's team, was scheduled. It was intended to demonstrate Elena's unassailable image to the press, reinforcing her narrative of grace, poise, and flawless conduct. But Alexander saw it differently. He saw it as an opportunity. He arrived early, dressed in a way that minimized attention yet allowed him to observe the room and the key players. Marcus was present, as expected, calm, controlled, confident. Elena moved through the room with her usual poise, unaware of the silent scrutiny directed at her husband. The network was in full display. Journalists carefully guided, aides subtly ensuring the right optics, and the crowd responding exactly as Marcus had anticipated. Alexander's first move was subtle, almost invisible. He initiated a series of discreet conversations with peripheral players, minor aides, background staff, journalists not directly in Marcus's inner circle. Through careful questioning and gentle prompts, he gathered snippets of information, private timings, offhand remarks, and inconsistencies in the narrative that could later be exploited. Every piece of intelligence was carefully logged, cross-referenced, and verified. Alexander had learned that information alone was not power. Its strategic deployment was what mattered. He began to craft a plan to expose certain weaknesses in the network, to reveal truths without appearing vengeful or desperate. But Alexander's careful maneuvering did not go entirely unnoticed. Marcus, with his acute perception, sensed a shift. He did not confront Alexander directly, but subtle signals of caution began to appear. A wary glance here, a carefully measured smile there, small adjustments in the way Marcus orchestrated Elena's appearances. Marcus was aware of a variable he could not control, and it unsettled him. The tension escalated as Alexander prepared for the next phase, leveraging the information he had gathered to subtly undermine Marcus's influence. This required absolute precision, timing, and discretion. One misstep could expose him completely, giving Marcus the upper hand again. The first strike would be small, almost imperceptible, designed to create doubt and instability without triggering a direct confrontation. Alexander carefully chose his target, a minor narrative the media had picked up on, one that Marcus assumed was secure. By subtly correcting the story and providing selective information, Alexander created a ripple effect. The correction was minor but authoritative, undermining Marcus's control and signaling to the network that Alexander was aware, vigilant, and capable. The response was immediate. Marcus's usual calm demeanor wavered for the first time, if only slightly. Elena, for her part, did not understand the subtle shift, but she sensed the tension. The network's equilibrium had been disturbed, and Alexander had successfully injected doubt without revealing his hand. This small victory was crucial. It demonstrated that the network, though vast and powerful, was not infallible. It also boosted Alexander's confidence, reaffirming his belief that careful observation, strategic planning, and precise action could reclaim some measure of control. Yet, the victory was tempered by the realization of how much remained at stake. Marcus was relentless, and Elena's charisma made her untouchable in public perception. The network was far from dismantled, and the next moves would be far more dangerous. Every step forward risked exposure, betrayal, and retaliation. And just as Alexander began to plan his next strike, a new threat emerged, one that neither he nor Marcus had anticipated. A mysterious figure, operating outside the known network, had begun to intervene in subtle ways. Anonymous tips to the press, cryptic messages, and unexplained events that hinted at knowledge far beyond Alexander's current understanding. The existence of this unknown player introduced a new variable, one that could disrupt both Alexander's carefully planned strategies and Marcus's meticulous control. The identity, motives, and intentions of this figure were unknown, creating a dangerous uncertainty. Alexander realized that the game had shifted once again. What had begun as a battle between him, Elena, and Marcus had now expanded into an even more complex and unpredictable struggle. The network he had been studying was only one layer of a far larger, more intricate web. As Alexander prepared for the next move, he understood one crucial truth. To succeed, He would need not only strategy and intelligence, but also intuition, courage, and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. Every decision, every action, and every calculated risk would determine the outcome of this high-stakes game. And as the shadows lengthened and the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, Alexander received an anonymous message that changed everything. A single line of text, unsigned, hinting at a revelation that could dismantle the network entirely, but at a cost he could not yet comprehend. The first strike had been made. The network had been challenged. But the real battle, the one that would determine loyalty, betrayal, and power, was only just beginning.